This video is a review of homework questions, chapter 32, numbers 5, 6, 7, and problem number 3. Okay, so number 5 says, why does a reduction in aggregate demand in the actual economy reduce real output rather than the price level? And the answer is very straightforward, because of sticky prices, downward sticky, especially input prices. It goes on to ask, why might a full-strength multiplier apply to the decrease in aggregate demand? And of course, that's because as aggregate demand shifts back to the left here to AD2, we come along here. We slide along here because of the ratchet effect again, and we wind up right there getting the full multiplier effect. If prices had been coming down, if we had been able to slide along here, we would not have gotten the full multiplier effect. This is going to result in Y2 way below full employment level of output, full multiplier effect. If prices had come down, we only would have wound up here, maybe 60, 70, 80% of the multiplier instead of the whole multiplier effect. Number 6. Unemployment can be caused by a decrease of aggregate demand or a decrease of aggregate supply. In each case, specify the price level outcomes. So that statement is true. They want you to explain or evaluate it. It's a true statement. A decrease in aggregate supply will unambiguously, so if aggregate supply shifts to the left, let's say it comes over here to AS2, we move here, output declines. Let's call this Y3 this time, okay, associated with that output right there. But the price level goes up to PL2. So the answer they want here is that a decrease in aggregate supply will unambiguously increase the price level and reduce real output. That's like when we have an increase in gas prices, when OPEC or the Arab nations drive oil prices up, input prices rise, cost push inflation, we get an increase in price level and a decrease in output, and some people get laid off. A decrease in aggregate demand, you can already see here that it shifts, it reduces output all the way to here. It'll have a more modest effect on unemployment if we had been operating at a position beyond full employment, AD3. Now this is an unsustainable level of output. We'll call it Y4 here. We can't maintain this, like I said in previous videos, because everybody's working overtime. Input prices are eventually going to be driven up, and eventually we're going to move back to here. But let's say that we're temporarily operating out there because of a boom in the economy, and then the bubble busts, and we move back to AD1. We get a reduction of output, a modest reduction in prices, and we don't get the full multiplier effect. If we're operating either at AD1 or, God forbid, we're operating at AD2 and things get worse, then we're going to shift even further to the right, and there'll be there'll be almost no price level decrease, but a much stronger output. The full multiplier will apply to that reduction in output. All right, DQ number 7, question number 7. Use shifts of the AD and AS curve to explain the U.S. experience of strong economic growth, full employment, and price stability in the 1990s and the early 2000s. And then B, a strong negative wealth effect, how a strong negative wealth effect from a precipitous drop in house prices could cause a recession even though productivity is surging. All right, so the experience of the 1990s and the early 2000s was with aggregate demand shifting to the right and aggregate supply shifting to the right. And you've already seen that graph that I drew, that increases in aggregate supply that were sustainable because productivity increased dragged the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right, and we had a period of increases. Let's say we started off at this point right here, PL1, we were right here at equilibrium. Aggregate supply increased because of productivity growth to aggregate supply 3. Aggregate demand shifted to the right because of strong income growth and people spending a lot more. There was very little impact on the price level. We had great price stability. Even though people had more money, AD was shifting to the right, so was AS. So that's the early 1990s and the early 2000s. When the housing bubble burst, aggregate supply, well, what they're saying is that there was continuing growth in aggregate supply. So even though aggregate supply continued to grow, aggregate demand fell quite a bit, and we moved from this point to this point. So we had a reduction of output, even though we had increases in productivity, but because aggregate demand, the bottom fell out of the housing market and aggregate demand shifted to the left, we wound up in a slight recession at that time. Well, actually a big recession at that time anyway. I'm going to show you the graph that they drew in the answer key here. So I'm going to hold it up close so you can see that. You might want to take a screenshot or pause the video right here and get a good look at that graph of what happened in the housing bubble burst in 2007, 2008. Okay? All right. Okay, so I paused the video so that I could erase the board and redraw this graph, which is what you should have drawn for problem number 3, homework problem number 3. Suppose that the aggregate demand and aggregate supply schedules for a hypothetical economy are shown below. There's a table of numbers in the book. You're supposed to graph it. Using these sets of data, graph the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves. What is the equilibrium price level? And of course, it's 200. Okay, and what is the equilibrium level of real output? And 300. Okay, so that was an easy start to this whole thing. Okay, is the equilibrium real output necessarily the full employment real output? And somebody actually sent me a comment and asked about that. I think it's posted in the discussions. Jason sent the question asking me to explain a little bit about, is the actual equilibrium necessarily the full employment equilibrium? And the answer is no. An economy can be stuck below the full employment level of equilibrium. So it's not necessarily the full employment equilibrium. It's virtually impossible to be stuck above the full employment level because input prices would rise, but we can wind up being stuck below it. So the answer there was no. B, if the price level in the economy is 150, what's going to happen here? And of course, the answer is that aggregate demand will fall short of, will exceed aggregate supply. This is the aggregate supply curve. Will fall short by an amount of what? 200 billion. Okay. If the price level is 250, will quantity demanded equal, exceed, or fall short? So at price level of 250, back to my blue one here, we will exceed aggregate demand. I'm sorry, aggregate demand will fall short of aggregate supply by 200 billion. And then C, suppose buyers desire to purchase 200 billion more at each level of output. So now we just move all of this over for the aggregate demand over to 200 billion, so that here we're at 300. At 250, we're at 400. At price level of 200, we're at 500. And you can see I'm clearly sketching out AD1 that is far to the right here, okay? What is the new equilibrium price level and output? And I think that these points are supposed to be all together right here. So the new equilibrium output is going to be 400 billion, and the equilibrium price level will be 250 there. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I got it. It's always good to get it right if you're the teacher. All right, so there's our review of the homework. Hopefully you checked it against your own homework. Some of you had some very good homework. Some of you had some very poor homeworks. Please increase the level of your homeworks and learn from these videos. Correct your homework so you have that for the to study for the final.